Welcome to Sleepy Dungeons. Tonight, as you prepare to rest, I invite you to journey with me into the cradle of civilization, where myths of gods, floods, and cosmic creation shaped the very first human stories. We are going back over 5,000 years, to 3100 BC, into the land of Mesopotamia, the fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the Sumerians rose from the floodplains to build the world's earliest cities, invent writing, and dream of eternity. Their story is one of astonishing brilliance and haunting fragility. They left behind great monuments, epic tales, and the first codes of law. And yet, for all their achievements, they fell into silence, their voices preserved only on broken tablets of clay. As you listen, allow the flow of their story to quiet your thoughts. Each detail will come to you like the gentle rhythm of a river, carrying away the restlessness of the day. You are safe, and you are calm. Let the ancient echoes of Sumer guide you into peaceful rest. May the mysteries of their past bring you stillness, and may your night be filled with good dreams. Sumer was unlike anything the world had known before. In the south of Mesopotamia, they took mud and reed and transformed them into cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Ur. They carved lines into clay that became the first written words. They told stories of gods who shaped the heavens and the earth, who sent floods to test humanity, and who granted kingship as a divine gift. These myths are not merely relics of the past, but the earliest whispers of humanity asking, where did we come from? Why are we here? What forces shape our fate? Such questions still echo in us today, which is why their story continues to fascinate. In the beginning, there was water. Endless, unshaped, formless. From it rose Namu, the primeval mother, who birthed heaven and earth. From heaven and earth came Enlil, the air, who tore them apart and gave space for life. To the Sumerians, creation was not accidental, it was an order drawn from chaos. And in this balance between gods, rivers, and people, the first civilization found its identity. They believed humanity itself had been molded from clay, breathed into life by divine command, to serve and honor the gods. For them, every harvest, every flood, every act of kingship was bound to this cosmic order. Their power came not only from faith but from mastery of their land. They tamed rivers with canals and levees, turning desert into farmland that could feed thousands. From this abundance came trade, art, and learning. From their clay tablets came the stories of Gilgamesh, the first epic hero who searched for immortality. From their temples rose ziggurats, stairways to heaven that symbolized both devotion and ambition. And from their laws came the first attempts to bind people to justice, to protect the weak and guide the strong. These were the gifts of Sumer, gifts that shaped every culture that followed. And yet, woven into their story is a darker thread. For all their brilliance, they were vulnerable, to floods that destroyed fields, to droughts that withered crops, to enemies at their borders, and to corruption within their own walls. Their civilization endured for centuries, but in the end, it fell. The silence of their ruins reminds us that no achievement, no matter how divine or mighty, lasts forever. In this episode, we will walk through their story step by step. We will explore the land that gave them birth, uncover their founding myths, witness their early innovations, and meet the heroes and rulers who defined their age. We will see their cities flourish, their society thrive, and their culture reach its golden peak. We will also confront the crises that fractured them, the invasions that shook them, and the disasters that finally brought them down. Along the way, we will enter the realm of mystery, lost artifacts, forgotten myths, and unanswered questions that still haunt historians today. Finally, we will reflect on the legacy of Sumer, the lessons they leave us, and the provocative truth that even the first civilization, with all its brilliance, could not escape the passage of time. So settle in, let your mind drift as the story unfolds. If you have come this far, let me invite you to subscribe now, so you never miss another haunting journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, the tale of Sumer will guide you gently into rest, weaving together curiosity and calm until sleep takes you, and your dreams are touched by the whispers of the world's first civilization. Long before the Sumerians inscribed their first symbols into clay, the land that would cradle their civilization was already shaping its destiny. Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers, stretched across the broad, fertile plain where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their way from distant mountains to the Persian Gulf. These rivers, untamed and unpredictable, overflowed their banks each year, releasing both destruction and renewal. They drowned fields, tore apart settlements, and yet, when the waters receded, they left behind rich silt, black and fertile, capable of producing abundant harvests. It was this fragile balance between chaos and fertility that laid the foundation for the earliest urban experiments, and it was this balance the Sumerians would one day master and mythologize. The land itself was harsh, with summers that scorched the plains under relentless heat, and winters that brought cold winds sweeping across the flat horizon. Rain was sparse and unreliable, making dependence on the rivers absolute. Beyond the fertile strips of irrigated land stretched deserts and marshes, where survival was tenuous. The Sumerians had no mountains to quarry for stone, no great forests to cut for timber, and no rich mines of precious metals. Their resources seemed meager: mud from the rivers, reeds from the marshes, and clay baked hard by the sun. And yet, from these simple materials they built homes, temples, and tools that endured for millennia. The environment forced them to innovate, to imagine ways to transform scarcity into abundance, and to turn fragile survival into civilization. Before the rise of Sumer, other cultures had already tested the soil of Mesopotamia. The Ubaid culture, thriving from about 1500 BC, left behind traces of villages organized around communal temples. Their pottery bore intricate designs, their irrigation canals hinted at early mastery of water, and their houses revealed a society already structured in layers of status. These predecessors laid the first stones of a foundation that Sumerians would later elevate into monumental cities. Their lives were simpler, their tools cruder, but they introduced the rhythms of settled farming, the patterns of shared labor, and the seeds of religious ritual that would bloom in Sumer's future. The geography of Mesopotamia shaped more than farming, it shaped the psychology of its people. To the north rose distant mountains, unreachable but a source of timber and stone. To the south stretched marshes and the sea, mysterious gateways to lands of trade but also barriers against expansion. The flat openness of the plain meant that no settlement could ever feel secure. Nomadic tribes swept across the land, raiding and retreating with ease. There were no natural defenses, only walls of mud brick and the courage of communities bound together in mutual survival. This vulnerability bred both resilience and anxiety, encouraging cooperation within settlements but also rivalry among them. The rivers could not be controlled by one family or one village. Their waters demanded collective management, giving rise to councils, leaders, and priests who organized the digging of canals and the repair of levees. Out of necessity grew hierarchy, and out of hierarchy grew the first outlines of political order. The land itself was alive in the imagination of the people. Every flood was not only a natural event but a divine message. The silt that gave life was interpreted as a gift from gods, while drought or disaster was seen as their wrath. In this way, the geography was not only physical but spiritual. The endless flat horizon became the canvas upon which myths were painted, myths that explained why rivers rose and why crops failed, myths that gave meaning to storms and droughts. Even before writing, these stories circulated, binding communities with a shared sense of destiny tied to the land. By the time the first Sumerian cities began to take shape, the region was already a tapestry of influences: villages from earlier cultures, nomads who passed through, farmers who worked the land, and priests who claimed to interpret the will of the gods. The conditions for civilization were not easy, but they were unique: fertile yet fragile, abundant yet dangerous, demanding ingenuity, cooperation, and faith. It was here, in this paradox of harshness and fertility, that Sumer would rise, carrying with it the weight of the land's gifts and its threats. The story of the Sumerians cannot be told without the story of Mesopotamia itself, for the rivers, the soil, and the climate created the stage upon which humanity first attempted civilization. Out of this demanding land, fragile settlements learned to endure, and from their endurance came the world's first great cities. The land before Sumer was already whispering the outlines of a destiny that would change the course of human history. The origins of Sumer shimmer between history and myth, a blend of archaeology and legend that makes their beginnings both fascinating and elusive. According to their own stories, humanity and the world itself emerged not from accident but from divine order imposed upon chaos. In the earliest times, all that existed was the endless sea, a watery void personified as the goddess Namu. From her womb came in, the sky, and Ki, the earth. Their union gave birth to Enlil, the god of air, who forced the sky and earth apart, creating the space where life could flourish. This cosmic separation, an act of both violence and necessity, became the foundation of the Sumerian worldview. Existence itself was fragile, dependent on balance between the forces above, below, and in between. The gods, in Sumerian belief, were not distant abstractions but living powers intertwined with every feature of the landscape. The waters were gods, the winds were gods, the sun and moon were gods. Creation was not a single act but an ongoing process, maintained by rituals and offerings. Humanity was born into this order not as masters of nature but as servants of the divine. One myth tells of humans molded from clay mixed with the breath of the gods, formed to relieve the deities of their labor. People were created to dig canals, tend fields, and maintain temples, tasks vital to sustaining life in Mesopotamia. This belief carried profound implications. Every act of farming, building, or governance was more than survival. It was a sacred duty performed in partnership with divine powers. Among their earliest sacred cities, Eridu was remembered as the first place where kingship descended from heaven. Here, the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh waters, was worshipped as the patron of civilization itself. Archaeological excavations at Eridu confirm that it was indeed one of the earliest settlements, with temples built and rebuilt over millennia. Beneath the soil lie layers of shrines, each constructed upon the ruins of its predecessor, evidence of a place considered sacred beyond measure. The continuity of worship here gives weight to the myth that civilization itself began at Eridu, with gods laying the foundation and humans merely building upon divine design. Yet not all myths were peaceful. Sumerian stories also carried warnings about the fragility of human existence. In the Eridu Genesis, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a great flood. Zayusadra, a pious man, is chosen by the god Enki and warned to build a great boat. He survives the deluge, preserves life, and is granted immortality. This story, older than the biblical tale of Noah, reflects the intimate relationship between the Sumerians and their rivers. The floods that both nourished and destroyed their lands found expression in myth as divine judgment. The flood story is more than allegory, it is a reflection of lived reality, where entire harvests and villages could vanish underwater, leading survivors to interpret disaster as punishment or test. Archaeology adds dimension to these myths, offering glimpses of how legends took shape in lived experience. Tablets uncovered at Uruk and Ur record genealogies of kings, mixing mythical rulers with historical ones, suggesting that even memory itself was mythologized. Names like Al-Elam and Dumuzi, the shepherd king, blur the line between divine ancestor and human leader. This merging of myth and history reveals how identity was constructed. To be Sumerian was to be part of a cosmic drama where the gods had established order, and kingship itself was proof of their continued presence. Symbolic stories like these gave the people a shared identity that transcended clan and city. They were not simply inhabitants of villages or farmers of fields, they were a chosen people, created for purpose, living under the gaze of gods who demanded both reverence and labor. Myths told them where they came from, why they suffered, and what destiny required of them. In times of prosperity, these stories reinforced gratitude to the divine. In times of hardship, they provided meaning for suffering. They were a psychological anchor in a land that could shift from abundance to catastrophe overnight. Even today, their myths provoke fascination. They remind us that the first civilization did not merely invent writing and architecture, but also sought to explain existence itself. Their stories survive not as simple fables but as the earliest recorded attempts to grapple with life, death, chaos, and order. They remind us that from the beginning, humanity has been telling itself stories to endure, to inspire, and to believe. The origins of Sumer are therefore not only a chapter in history but a mirror held up to the timeless human need to understand where we come from and what forces shape our fate. The survival of the Sumerians depended first on their ingenuity, for the land they inhabited was unforgiving even as it offered immense potential. The fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates could be abundant, but only if carefully managed. The rivers did not flood with predictable gentleness, they raged with sudden force, destroying crops and homes, or else ran too low, leaving fields to wither. To live here required more than hope, it required innovation. The Sumerians answered this challenge by digging canals, constructing levees, and mastering irrigation on a scale never before attempted. Through these systems they diverted water into their fields, ensuring that barley, wheat, flax, and dates grew in abundance. What nature denied, human cooperation created. Surplus harvests meant that food could be stored, labor could be specialized, and entire cities could rise. From agriculture sprang the first great innovations of Sumer. Clay, abundant and pliable, became the cornerstone of their material culture. It was pressed into bricks that built their homes and temples, into jars that stored their grain, and into tablets that bore the marks of their first writing system, cuneiform. What began as simple tallies to record harvests and offerings evolved into complex scripts capable of capturing contracts, myths, prayers, and laws. Writing allowed memory to outlast generations, binding the past to the present and creating the first continuity of history. Without cuneiform, Sumer might have vanished without a trace. With it, their voices still reach us across thousands of years. The wheel, another of their monumental innovations, also began with clay. First used by potters to spin vessels, it was soon adapted to transport, revolutionizing trade and labor. With carts and wagons, goods could move between cities, linking Uruk, Ur, and Lagash in networks of exchange. Their merchants traveled far, bartering grain and textiles for copper, timber, and precious stones from Anatolia, Persia, and even the Indus Valley. Each journey expanded their world, bringing back not just resources but ideas, weaving Sumer into a fabric of cultures that stretched far beyond their rivers. Daily life in these early centuries reflected both simplicity and sophistication. Farmers rose with the sun, guiding oxen to plow furrows in the heavy soil, while women brewed beer, a staple drink safer than water and rich enough to sustain laborers. Children learned trades from their parents, though a select few studied under scribes in temple schools, memorizing signs and practicing on clay until they could master the art of writing. Artisans worked in workshops shaping metal, weaving cloth, or crafting jewelry, their goods destined for both local markets and foreign traders. Though most lived in modest mud brick homes clustered along narrow streets, the rhythm of their days was organized by temples and markets, where community life flourished. The temple loomed over all, not only as a house of worship but as a center of administration and survival. Priests oversaw the distribution of grain, the management of irrigation, and the coordination of labor. Offerings flowed into the temples, reinforcing the belief that prosperity came only through the favor of the gods. To defy the temple was to risk not only political punishment but cosmic disorder. This intertwining of the sacred and the practical was one of Sumer's defining features, ensuring that survival was always linked with belief. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every tablet of account bore the imprint of both human effort and divine expectation. Survival also demanded defense. With no natural barriers, the plains were exposed to raiders and nomadic tribes. Communities fortified themselves with walls of baked brick and organized militias to patrol their borders. Wars were fought not only for protection but also for control of water and fertile land, making irrigation canals as valuable as palaces. Victory in these conflicts ensured prosperity, while defeat meant ruin. Leadership in these times became closely tied to military success, for survival required rulers who could protect the fields as much as they could manage them. What emerges from these centuries is a picture of resilience. The Sumerians turned harshness into opportunity, transforming mud and water into the foundations of civilization. Their innovations, writing, the wheel, irrigation, trade, were not luxuries but lifelines, born from necessity. Yet each invention reshaped their society, expanding its horizons and deepening its complexity. By mastering survival, they laid the groundwork for greatness. From the humblest clay tablet to the bustling markets of their cities, every act of ingenuity moved them closer to the brilliance of their golden age. Their survival was never guaranteed, but through determination and innovation, they ensured that their legacy would endure long after their fields had turned to dust. The rise of leaders and heroes in Sumer transformed scattered settlements into powerful city-states and gave shape to a civilization that saw kingship as a sacred trust handed down from the heavens. According to their own records, kingship itself was lowered from heaven, and no ruler could reign without divine approval. Leadership in Sumer was therefore not simply a matter of strength or inheritance but a cosmic legitimacy, binding the fate of cities to the will of the gods. In this setting, rulers emerged whose names became immortalized in both legend and history, men whose deeds forged the cultural identity of their people. One of the most enduring figures was Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, whose reign around 2700 BC left an imprint deeper than mere politics. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay centuries later, presents him as two-thirds divine and one-third human, a warrior, a builder, and a seeker of truth. He constructed mighty walls around Uruk and undertook adventures that tested both his strength and his spirit. His friendship with Enkidu, his battle with Humbaba the monster, and his futile quest for immortality revealed the Sumerian understanding of kingship. Even rulers touched by the gods remained mortal, burdened by the same fears of death as the humblest farmer. Through Gilgamesh, the Sumerians celebrated the glory of leadership while also acknowledging its limits. He embodied both triumph and vulnerability, showing that even the greatest king could not escape the human condition. Beyond Gilgamesh, other rulers of Sumer etched their presence into stone and story. Enmebrajesi of Kish, one of the earliest historically attested kings, led campaigns against neighboring Elam and set a precedent for military expansion. His name survives on stone vessels, making him one of the first figures to bridge myth and archaeology. His son, Aga of Kish, continued his reign but was famously defeated by Gilgamesh, a tale that illustrates not only rivalry between city-states but also the constant struggle for supremacy that defined Sumerian politics. Leadership was always contested, and victory in war often decided legitimacy as much as divine sanction did. Rulers like Eannatum of Lagash expanded their power through conquest and left behind monuments that boasted of their victories. The Stele of the Vultures, one of the earliest war memorials, depicts Eannatum leading soldiers into battle, their spears aligned in disciplined formation. This monument reveals that Sumer was one of the first societies to develop organized military structures, where armies marched not as mobs but as coordinated forces. Through such victories, leaders not only expanded their cities but also projected the image of divine favor, claiming that their triumphs were the will of the gods. Kingship, therefore, was always a delicate balance between military success, administrative skill, and religious devotion. The role of leaders extended beyond war. Kings were also builders, commissioning canals, temples, and walls that secured their cities and glorified their gods. Each construction project reinforced the authority of the ruler, linking his name to prosperity and divine service. Temples were expanded, ziggurats raised higher, and irrigation canals stretched farther, ensuring both survival and prestige. By inscribing their achievements on tablets and monuments, rulers made certain that their deeds would be remembered long after their deaths. Leadership was thus as much about legacy as it was about immediate power, and kings understood that their place in history depended on both divine approval and human remembrance. These leaders also shaped cultural identity. By commissioning hymns, myths, and legal codes, they reinforced the values of their society. They portrayed themselves as shepherds of their people, chosen by the gods to provide justice and protection. Even rebellion or resistance against rulers was often framed in spiritual terms, as if the gods themselves had withdrawn their favor from one king and bestowed it upon another. In this way, political power was inseparable from divine narrative, ensuring that the rise and fall of leaders was always seen as part of a larger cosmic order. The emergence of these rulers marked a turning point in the Sumerian story. They were not merely administrators of cities but symbols of the civilization itself, embodying its strength, its faith, and its ambitions. Their victories became the victories of their people, their failures, the collective suffering of their cities. Through them, Sumerians saw their own identity reflected, caught between divine destiny and human fragility. The rise of heroes and leaders laid the foundation for unity and rivalry alike, propelling Sumer toward an age of expansion that would test the strength of both kingship and civilization. As the city-states of Sumer grew in wealth and ambition, they looked beyond their own walls and fields to extend their influence over the plains and beyond. Expansion was not a single moment but a restless process, driven by rivalry, necessity, and the lure of power. Each city sought to dominate its neighbors, and the open geography of Mesopotamia made conflict inevitable. Uruk, Kish, and Lagash all rose to prominence at different times, each claiming supremacy, each carving its name into the story of expansion. The drive to control land, water, and trade routes transformed Sumer from a collection of settlements into a region constantly alive with the clash of armies and the weaving of alliances. Military conquest played a central role in this process. Kings assembled armies not of wandering militias but of disciplined ranks, marching with spears and axes, accompanied by primitive chariots pulled by donkeys. Their battles were brutal, fought for canals, fertile fields, and the prestige of divine kingship. The Steel of the Vultures immortalizes one such campaign, where the soldiers of Lagash, under King Eannatum, marched in tight formations, trampling enemies and scattering vultures across the battlefield. For the Sumerians, victory in war was not only a matter of survival but a proclamation of divine favor, proof that their gods had chosen them to rule. Each triumph expanded the reach of their city, each defeat risked collapse. Yet expansion was not only a story of war. Diplomacy and alliances also shaped the era. City-states forged treaties, exchanged emissaries, and married daughters of kings to bind rivals into peace. These fragile bonds often broke under the strain of ambition, but they reveal a world already experimenting with the forms of international relations. To secure trade and security, rulers had to balance aggression with negotiation, weaving networks of obligation that stretched across Mesopotamia. Expansion was thus both a sword and a contract, built on conquest but also on dialogue. Trade itself was perhaps the most enduring form of expansion. The cities of Sumer, rich in grain, textiles, and crafted goods, lacked vital resources such as metals, timber, and stone. To obtain these, merchants set out along rivers and desert routes, linking Sumer to distant lands. From Anatolia came copper and silver, from the mountains of Iran came precious stones, from the Indus Valley came exotic goods like carnelian and ivory. In return, Sumer exported grain, wool, and crafted objects. These exchanges not only enriched the cities but also brought cultural influences, spreading Sumerian ideas outward and absorbing foreign elements into their own society. The expansion of trade transformed the cities into hubs of a vast network, making them not only local powers but participants in an interconnected world. Religion too spread with this expansion. Sumerian gods and rituals traveled with merchants and soldiers, influencing neighboring peoples who adopted and adapted them. Deities like Inanna, Enlil, and Enki were worshipped beyond Sumer, their myths carried into Akkadian and Babylonian traditions. Through conquest, diplomacy, and trade, the Sumerians extended not only their material reach but their spiritual presence, leaving imprints on cultures far from the plains of Mesopotamia. Their expansion was therefore not only territorial but cultural, reshaping the beliefs and practices of their neighbors. Yet expansion carried costs. Constant warfare drained resources and lives, while treaties often collapsed into betrayal. Trade exposed Sumer to competition and envy, inviting raids on caravans and cities. The very openness that allowed connection also allowed intrusion, making the civilization vulnerable to stronger powers that would one day emerge. Expansion made Sumer great, but it also sowed the seeds of vulnerability, as rivals grew stronger by imitating their methods and exploiting their divisions. Still, this era marked a transformation. Sumer was no longer simply surviving on the bounty of its rivers, it was asserting itself across a wider stage. Its armies, merchants, and emissaries pushed beyond its borders, bringing back wealth, knowledge, and influence. The expansion era revealed a civilization determined to leave its imprint on the world, a restless drive that carried them toward the heights of prosperity and set the stage for the brilliance of their golden age. The age of prosperity in Sumer unfolded like the flowering of seeds long sown through centuries of struggle and survival. This was the time when the cities of the south rose to their greatest heights, when temples and palaces loomed like mountains of brick over the flat horizon, and when the hum of daily life was matched by the rhythm of festivals, trade, and intellectual inquiry. Uruk grew into a metropolis whose walls enclosed tens of thousands of people, making it one of the first great cities in human history. Uar, Lagash, and Nippur followed with their own monuments, canals, and marketplaces, each competing for glory but together representing the zenith of Sumerian achievement. In this era, the vision of civilization itself seemed fulfilled, people living in organized harmony, guided by divine kingship, and surrounded by art, learning, and prosperity. The ziggurats became the most striking symbols of this prosperity. Towering step pyramids of mud brick, they reached toward the heavens, their summit shrines serving as bridges between mortals and gods. These monumental structures required vast resources and coordinated labor, feats of engineering that testified to both devotion and discipline. The great ziggurat of Uar, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was not only a religious center but also a statement of civic pride, rising above the city as a visible reminder of its wealth and faith. Surrounding temples thrived with offerings, rituals, and hymns, reinforcing the idea that prosperity was inseparable from divine favor. Art and craftsmanship flourished alongside architecture. Sculptors carved statues of worshippers with clasped hands and wide eyes, frozen in perpetual reverence. Jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli adorned the elite, while artisans inscribed intricate designs into cylinder seals that bore both function and beauty, marking property and sealing contracts with miniature works of art. Music filled the air of temples and courts, with lyres, harps, and flutes accompanying hymns and poetry. The famous lyres uncovered in the royal cemetery of Uar revealed both the sophistication of their instruments and the cultural importance of music in ritual and daily life. This was a society not merely surviving but celebrating, creating objects and traditions that expressed joy, devotion, and refinement. Religion reached new heights during this period. The pantheon of gods was organized into a structured hierarchy, with an Enlil, Enki, and Inanna among the central deities. Festivals grew in grandeur, involving processions, sacrifices, and theatrical rituals that united entire communities. Myths were inscribed in greater detail, recording cosmic battles, divine loves, and the moral struggles of gods and men. These stories were not simple entertainment, they reflected profound reflections on the nature of existence, mortality, and justice. The Epic of Gilgamesh, shaped and refined during this era, stands as a monument to human thought, wrestling with questions of death and the search for meaning in a world governed by fate. Scientific and intellectual progress accompanied these spiritual achievements. Sumerian scholars refined mathematics, creating tables of multiplication, division, and geometry. Their base 60 system remains with us today in the way we measure time in circles. Astronomers track the stars and planets, linking celestial patterns to both agricultural calendars and divine will. Physicians recorded remedies for ailments, combining practical herbs and treatments with incantations to healing gods. Each area of knowledge reflected the blend of rational observation and spiritual interpretation that defined Sumerian thought. In their libraries of clay, the foundations of science were laid alongside hymns and prayers, showing that wisdom, to them, encompassed both the material and the divine. The rulers of this age became legendary for their prosperity and justice. Ur-Nammu of Ur established one of the earliest known legal codes, ensuring fairness and order across his kingdom. His laws addressed theft, injury, and property disputes, creating a system where justice was not arbitrary but inscribed in writing for all to see. Kings in this age were celebrated not only as warriors but as builders of justice, shepherds of their people who brought stability and prosperity. Their reigns were remembered as golden, their names linked with temples, canals, and laws that outlasted their lifetimes. This prosperity spread through society, touching even the lives of ordinary people. Farmers reaped steady harvests from carefully managed canals, artisans found markets for their goods, and merchants prospered from long-distance trade. Families gathered in modest homes, sharing bread, beer, and stories, their lives enriched by the stability around them. While inequality remained, the prosperity of the age gave most a sense of security, anchoring them to cities that felt eternal, blessed by gods and guided by strong rulers. The age of prosperity was not a dream but a lived reality, one carved into brick, inscribed in clay, and sung in hymns. It was the moment when Sumer seemed most secure, most certain that its civilization would endure forever. Yet even in this golden glow, shadows were forming at the edges, for no age of prosperity is free from the seeds of decline. The splendor of Sumer's golden age would one day make its fall all the more poignant, a reminder that even the brightest civilizations cannot escape the cycles of history. Sumerian society at its height was a carefully ordered tapestry, woven from wealth, tradition, and deeply rooted cultural values. Every person, from king to laborer, occupied a place within a system that reflected both divine will and human necessity. At the top of this structure stood the kings, whose rule was legitimized by the gods and reinforced through monumental architecture, laws, and conquest. They were supported by priests who served as intermediaries between humanity and the divine, overseeing temples that functioned not only as religious centers but also as the beating heart of economic and political life. These elites lived in luxury, adorned with jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli, entertained by musicians, and surrounded by symbols of their power. Below them were noble families, wealthy merchants, and scribes who sustained the administration of the cities. The scribes, in particular, occupied a privileged place, for their mastery of cuneiform gave them control over contracts, taxes, and records. To write was to preserve authority, and those who could command the stylus wielded influence far beyond their numbers. Merchants prospered as well, traveling along trade routes and returning with goods that dazzled markets and temples. The movement of wealth through their hands ensured that Sumerian culture was not isolated but enriched by the treasures of distant lands. At the heart of society, however, were the farmers, laborers, and artisans who supported the weight of the entire system. Farmers tended the canals and fields that fed the cities, their work both backbreaking and sacred. Artisans filled workshops with pottery, tools, textiles, and jewelry, creating goods that served both daily needs and ritual offerings. Though their lives were modest, their work gave substance to Sumerian prosperity. Below them were slaves, captives of war, debtors who could not repay, and those born into bondage. Though lacking freedom, even slaves were woven into the fabric of society, their labor essential to the functioning of households and temples. Family life formed the foundation of this society. Households often extended across multiple generations, with grandparents, parents, and children sharing space within modest mud-brick dwellings. Marriage was both a personal bond and an economic contract, often arranged by families and formalized through written agreements. Dowries and obligations were carefully recorded, showing how deeply the written word penetrated daily life. Women, while largely subordinate to men, played crucial roles in managing households, weaving textiles, brewing beer, and raising children. Some women held positions of prominence, serving as priestesses or property holders, a reminder that gender roles, though defined, were not without exceptions. Children were cherished, their upbringing tied to both family honor and the hope of continuing prosperity. Rituals and traditions bound society together in cycles of worship and celebration. Festivals dedicated to gods like Inanna, Enlil, and Nana drew entire communities into processions, music, and offerings. These moments of joy reaffirmed collective identity, blending devotion with festivity. Markets bustled during these occasions, and feasts filled streets and courtyards with bread, beer, dates, and roasted meats. Music, poetry, and dance became not only entertainment but sacred acts, performed in honor of the gods who were believed to dwell within the ziggurats towering over the cities. Religion was everywhere in Sumerian life, shaping not only the sacred calendar but also the rhythms of work, trade, and governance. Law and governance reinforced the stability of society. Early codes such as those of Ur-Nammu set forth standards of justice that sought to protect the weak, regulate commerce, and punish wrongdoing. These codes reveal a concern for fairness, showing that the Sumerians understood the importance of order in sustaining prosperity. Disputes over land, contracts, and family matters were brought before judges, and records of their resolutions were inscribed in clay, ensuring transparency and permanence. In this way, law became both shield and sword, binding the society in an agreed sense of justice and accountability. The wealth and cultural richness of Sumer extended into intellectual life as well. Schools for scribes, known as tablet houses, trained the next generation in writing, mathematics, and literature. Students copied proverbs, hymns, and legal formulas, preserving wisdom while practicing skill. These texts reveal a culture that valued knowledge as highly as wealth, understanding that learning was a form of legacy. Literature thrived, from myths of gods and heroes to proverbs that conveyed the lessons of daily life. Poetry and hymns, written in cuneiform, show that the Sumerians not only survived but reflected, imagined, and created beauty in their words. For ordinary people, life was not without hardship, but it carried a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. They worked the fields, raised families, and joined in festivals, all under the watchful eyes of gods and kings. Their society gave them meaning and structure, a place within a divine order that promised stability and protection. To be Sumerian was to live in a world where every harvest, every law, every prayer was part of a cosmic balance. It was this sense of connection between people, gods, and land that made their society thrive. And yet, beneath this harmony, tension stirred, for prosperity and order often conceal the seeds of discontent that grow in silence until they can no longer be ignored. The brilliance of Sumerian society began to dim when the very structures that had sustained it grew heavy with corruption and imbalance. The prosperity of the Golden Age bred inequality, and the authority of kings and priests, once seen as sacred, increasingly drew suspicion and resentment. Temples that had served as the heart of community life became centers of immense wealth and political intrigue. Offerings meant to honor the gods were often absorbed into the coffers of elites, while the burden of taxation and forced labor fell heavily on farmers and laborers. The divine mandate of kingship began to feel less like a blessing and more like a weight crushing the people who upheld it. Succession disputes amplified this fragility. Kingship was supposed to descend from the gods, yet in practice it passed through bloodlines, generals, or usurpers who claimed legitimacy by force. Every time a ruler died, cities risked falling into chaos as rivals vied for power. Brothers, sons, and ambitious governors turned succession into conflict, sometimes drawing entire cities into civil war. The divine aura of kingship suffered in these struggles, for if rulers truly held the mandate of heaven, why did the gods allow such chaos to follow their deaths? This question weakened faith in leadership, eroding the confidence that had once bound ruler and subject together. Economic decline further strained society. Over centuries of irrigation, the salt carried by river waters accumulated in the soil. Fields that once yielded abundant crops began to wither, their fertility poisoned by salinization. Farmers who had supplied granaries now struggled to meet quotas, while temples and rulers continued to demand offerings and taxes. The burden grew unbearable, forcing some into debt bondage. Families sold land or even children to repay what they owed, swelling the ranks of the enslaved and deepening resentment across the lower classes. Inequality, once accepted as part of divine order, began to provoke unrest as ordinary people realized that their sacrifices brought them little relief. Rebellions and uprisings erupted as frustration turned to violence. Tablets record citizens refusing tribute, workers abandoning fields, and subjects rising against rulers accused of corruption or neglect. Though many of these revolts were crushed, each left scars that weakened trust and stability. Cities that had once flourished through cooperation now faced the corrosive effects of suspicion, division, and bitterness. Rivalries between city-states intensified, with alliances shattered by betrayal and wars waged as much for dominance as for survival. Instead of unity, Sumer became a patchwork of competing powers locked in endless cycles of conflict. The spiritual foundation of Sumer also began to waver. As droughts, famines, and misfortunes mounted, people questioned whether the gods still favored their land. Priests continued their rituals, but doubts spread among the population. Festivals that had once been joyful became overshadowed by fear, as disasters were interpreted as divine wrath. For a people whose identity was built on the belief that they lived within a cosmic order upheld by gods, the loss of confidence in divine protection was devastating. Faith that had once inspired resilience now eroded into uncertainty. What had once been a society bound together by prosperity, law, and shared destiny now bore the marks of division. Corruption hollowed out the authority of temples, succession disputes destabilized governance, economic decline impoverished farmers, and rebellions fractured unity. The cracks within Sumer widened until they could no longer be hidden beneath the grandeur of ziggurats or the poetry of hymns. Even as their monuments towered proudly above the plains, their foundations trembled. The civilization that had pioneered writing, law, and monumental architecture was no longer secure, its greatness undermined from within. It was a slow unraveling, a weakening that left Sumer vulnerable to forces that would soon come crashing from beyond its borders. The pressures within Sumer were soon matched, and then overwhelmed, by the threats that came from beyond its borders. The flat, open plains of Mesopotamia had always been a crossroads, a land with no mountains or seas to shield it from the movements of tribes and armies. What once allowed trade and cultural exchange also left Sumer perpetually vulnerable. As its city-states fractured, outsiders began to see opportunities, and waves of invasions, migrations, and disasters converged to weaken the land that had once been the beacon of civilization. The first great challenge came from rival empires that rose in the north. The Akkadians, under Sargon, swept down from the central plains around 2334 BC, uniting the cities of Sumer under a single rule for the first time. Though Sargon's reign brought new glory, it also marked the end of Sumerian independence, as their kings became subjects within a broader empire. When the Akkadian state later weakened, Gutian tribes from the Zagros Mountains descended, pillaging cities and disrupting the intricate web of irrigation and trade that Sumer depended upon. These intrusions destabilized the region further, as foreign rulers often lacked the administrative skill or devotion to maintain the delicate balance of Sumerian society. Even after the Akkadians and Gutians receded, the memory of vulnerability lingered. New waves of pressure came from Amorite tribes moving into Mesopotamia, drawn by its fertile lands and weakened defenses. Unlike earlier invaders who plundered and withdrew, the Amorites settled, gradually integrating themselves into the cities until they rose to power, reshaping the political landscape. The inability of Sumerian rulers to repel or fully assimilate these groups revealed the fragility of their unity. What had once been a land of proud, independent city-states became a patchwork influenced, invaded, and eventually absorbed by outsiders. Natural forces struck with equal severity. The rivers that had always been both lifeline and threat unleashed floods that devastated cities, drowning fields and destroying homes. Archaeological layers reveal sudden deposits of river silt across ancient settlements, evidence of floods that left whole districts buried. At other times, the rains failed, and droughts withered crops, leaving famine in their wake. For a society so dependent on the careful regulation of water, these fluctuations were catastrophic. They not only destroyed harvests but also undermined faith in rulers and priests, whose legitimacy was tied to maintaining balance with the divine forces of nature. Plagues and epidemics, though less visible in the archaeological record, almost certainly added to the suffering. Dense urban centers with poor sanitation provided fertile ground for disease, and trade routes carried illnesses across regions. For populations already weakened by famine or war, sickness became another blow that thinned communities and deepened despair. The sense that the gods had abandoned their people intensified with every misfortune, eroding the spiritual foundations of the society even further. External threats were not only military or natural but also economic. Trade routes that had once flowed smoothly across the ancient Near East became disrupted by conflict, invasions, and instability. Precious resources like copper and tin, vital for making bronze, became harder to obtain. Without them, tools and weapons diminished in quality, leaving Sumer vulnerable both agriculturally and militarily. The loss of trade also drained wealth from the temples and markets, compounding the economic hardships already straining the people. What made these challenges so devastating was that they struck a society already fractured from within. Corruption, inequality, and rebellion had weakened the city-states, and so when invaders came, when rivers flooded, when drought struck, Sumer lacked the unity and resilience it once possessed. Instead of standing together against common threats, cities often turned against one another, allying with outsiders in desperate bids for survival. In this way, external threats did not simply attack Sumer, they exploited its weaknesses, accelerating its decline. The open plains of Mesopotamia that had once nurtured the first civilization became the stage for its undoing. Armies marched across it, floods swept over it, droughts scorched it, and waves of migrants poured into it. Each blow deepened the cracks within, leaving the proud ziggurats and temples of Sumer standing like weary guardians of a world that was slipping away. It was not a single invasion or disaster that destroyed them, but the relentless accumulation of external pressures that battered a society already struggling to hold itself together. The turning point for Sumer came when the accumulation of internal fractures and external pressures finally tipped the balance from resilience to collapse. For centuries, the Sumerians had endured invasions, famines, floods, and rivalries, but they had always managed to recover, rebuild, and reaffirm their identity as the first great civilization. Yet there came a moment when recovery was no longer possible, when the forces pulling them apart outweighed the ties that once held them together. The turning point was not a single battle or one catastrophic flood, but a convergence of betrayals, wars, and failures that pushed their society past the point of return. The rivalries among the city-states, long a defining feature of Sumerian life, grew increasingly destructive. Instead of uniting against external threats, the great cities of Uruk, Lagash, and Kish fought bitterly for dominance, exhausting their resources and weakening their defenses. Kings who should have been guardians of their people often turned their armies against neighboring cities, devastating farmland and scattering populations. Irrigation canals, the lifeblood of the region, were damaged or neglected during these wars, leaving fields barren and villages abandoned. Every conflict eroded the collective strength of the Sumerians, making them easy prey for stronger powers waiting at their borders. Betrayal from within also marked this turning point. Local governors and ambitious generals, once loyal to kings, seized opportunities to declare independence or to ally with invading forces. Loyalties fractured, and the unity that had once been symbolized by divine kingship dissolved into opportunism and self-preservation. Even religious institutions, once the anchors of stability, became entangled in political rivalries, with priests lending legitimacy to whichever ruler could offer them wealth and power. The sacred order that had bound society together was compromised, leaving the people uncertain of who truly held divine favor. Warfare during this period became increasingly desperate. Armies fought not for expansion or glory but for survival, raiding villages and enslaving populations to fill empty treasuries. The devastation of farmland turned once fertile plains into wastelands, compounding the effects of salinization that had already diminished crop yields. Famine spread, and with it unrest, as ordinary people bore the cost of wars they had not chosen. Desperation drove families into debt slavery, swelling the ranks of the dispossessed and deepening the divides between rich and poor. The promise of Sumerian prosperity, once so abundant, gave way to despair and bitterness. Natural disasters during this time only heightened the collapse. Severe droughts gripped the land, leaving irrigation canals empty and fields cracked under the relentless sun. Without food, communities scattered, seeking refuge in stronger or more stable regions. Floods alternated with drought, destroying settlements that had barely begun to recover. Each calamity was interpreted as the wrath of the gods, and faith in both rulers and priests declined further. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical hardships, for a people who had believed themselves created to serve the gods now questioned whether their gods had abandoned them. The Amorites, who had been moving into Mesopotamia for generations, now took advantage of this weakness. They did not sweep through as a conquering horde but infiltrated gradually, settling, trading, and eventually ruling within Sumerian cities. By the time they assumed power, the old order had already crumbled, and the Sumerians found themselves absorbed into a new political reality that no longer recognized their independence. The shift was subtle at first but irreversible, as Sumerian culture was overshadowed by new dynasties that borrowed from their traditions while erasing their autonomy. The turning point of Sumer's story lies in this combination of self-inflicted wounds and external intrusions. What had once been the strongest, most innovative society in the world had become a fractured land of weakened cities, betrayed alliances, and exhausted people. Their monuments still stood, their myths were still sung, but the vitality that had built them was gone. From this moment on, Sumer would never again rise to its former heights. It had crossed into decline, a decline that would culminate in its final collapse, leaving only ruins and echoes of a civilization that had once seemed eternal. The fall of Sumer was not a sudden collapse but the final unraveling of threads that had long been fraying. The glory of the Golden Age faded into the grim reality of weakened cities, devastated farmlands, and rulers who could no longer command the loyalty or resources needed to defend their people. The cities that had once gleamed with cigarettes and bustling markets became shells of their former selves, their walls crumbling and their streets empty by famine, disease, and war. What had once been the first and greatest experiment in human civilization gave way to silence, leaving only ruins for later ages to ponder. One of the most decisive blows came with the fall of Ur, the last great stronghold of Sumerian independence. Around 2004 BC, the Elamites, joined by Amorite tribes, descended upon the city. Despite its massive walls and storied temples, Ur could not withstand the assault. The city was plundered, its people enslaved or scattered, and its temples desecrated. The destruction of Ur marked more than the end of a city, it was the symbolic death of Sumer itself. For centuries, Ur had been a beacon of faith and prosperity, the seat of rulers like Ur-Nammu who had once codified laws and expanded influence. Its downfall signaled to all that the age of the Sumerians was over. The records of this collapse are haunting. Laments inscribed on tablets describe the gods abandoning their temples, their statues carried off by invaders, their voices falling silent. The people cried that the divine order itself had been broken, that the bond between heaven and earth had been severed. These laments are among the most poignant artifacts of Sumer, voices of a civilization witnessing its own destruction, mourning not only their homes and families but the very idea of their place in the cosmos. In their grief, they preserved the memory of what was lost, so that even in ruin, Sumer's voice would carry through time. In the aftermath, Amorite dynasties took control of Mesopotamia, establishing new centers of power that blended Sumerian traditions with their own. Babylon, once a minor city, began its ascent under Amorite rule, eventually overshadowing all that Sumer had been. The language of the Sumerians slowly gave way to Akkadian, used first alongside it and then replacing it entirely. Within a few generations, the Sumerian tongue was no longer spoken in daily life, preserved only as a language of scholars and priests. A culture that had given the world its first writing system, its first laws, and its first cities slipped into obscurity, remembered but no longer alive. The immediate aftermath of the fall was marked by dislocation and absorption. Sumerians who had once called themselves the chosen people of the gods now found themselves subjects of new rulers. Their temples were rededicated, their gods absorbed into broader Mesopotamian pantheons, their stories retold in new languages. Though fragments of their culture endured, the identity of Sumer as an independent civilization was gone. What remained were ruins, tablets buried in the earth, and myths carried into the traditions of those who came after. The fall of Sumer is perhaps most tragic because of the brilliance of what was lost. This was the civilization that had first asked the great questions, built the first cities, and imagined human life as part of a cosmic order. And yet, despite their innovations and achievements, they could not escape the cycles of decline that all civilizations face. Betrayal, war, famine, and invasion overwhelmed them, and in the end, the rivers that had once nourished their greatness flowed through silent fields where cities had stood. The collapse of Sumer did not erase its memory, but it transformed it. From then on, the Sumerians lived not as a people but as a legend, their legacy carried forward by the Babylonians and Assyrians, their stories embedded in myths that traveled far beyond Mesopotamia. The fall was both an ending and a transformation, closing the chapter of the first civilization while opening new ones for those who inherited their achievements. The silence of their ruins still speaks, reminding us that even the greatest societies are not immune to time, and that all that is built, no matter how divine or enduring it seems, is fragile before the tides of history. Even in their downfall, the Sumerians left behind puzzles that continue to haunt the imagination of scholars and dreamers alike. Their ruins, their broken tablets, and their scattered artifacts are fragments of a grand story, but much of that story remains incomplete, filled with gaps and silences that no excavation has yet resolved. These mysteries ensure that Sumer is not only remembered for what it achieved but also for what it still withholds, secrets buried in the soil and in the shadows of history. One of the greatest mysteries lies in the incompleteness of their records. The Sumerians invented writing, yet much of their literature survives only in fragments. Epic tales, hymns, and myths are broken across shards of clay, with missing lines and lost endings. The Genesis, their creation and flood story, survives only in pieces, leading us to wonder how the full narrative once unfolded. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though preserved more fully in later Akkadian versions, was originally Sumerian, and its earliest form remains elusive. How many other myths, laws, and stories have vanished entirely, crumbled into dust or washed away by floods. The thought that vast libraries of clay tablets once existed but are now lost to time fills their legacy with both awe and melancholy. Archaeological remains raise further questions. In cities like Eridu, layers upon layers of temples were built one atop another for thousands of years. Why was this site considered so sacred that rebuilding never ceased, even when other settlements nearby were thriving? Was it simply tradition, or did the people believe the gods themselves were tied to the soil of that exact place? The massive ziggurats, too, provoke curiosity. Constructed with mud bricks vulnerable to erosion, they have endured far longer than seems possible, suggesting methods of engineering that we still do not fully grasp. Their design inspired later cultures, but the details of their construction, maintenance, and symbolic meaning remain partly shrouded. There are also mysteries surrounding artifacts that have never been found. Sumerian texts describe sacred statues believed to house divine presence, ceremonial treasures offered by kings, and tablets of wisdom that held the secrets of the gods. Where are these objects now? Were they looted in antiquity, melted down, or broken by conquerors? Or do they still lie buried beneath layers of earth, waiting for a future discovery? Each missing artifact represents not just a physical loss but a missing piece of the Sumerian worldview, a silence where once there was meaning. The origins of the Sumerians themselves remain uncertain. Their language, unrelated to any known family, stands as an isolate, with no clear connection to other tongues. Did they emerge from the soil of Mesopotamia itself, or did they migrate from elsewhere, carrying their traditions into the land between the rivers? Archaeology has yet to answer definitively, leaving their sudden rise a mystery. How did a people, appearing seemingly from nowhere, create writing, law, monumental architecture, and organized religion so quickly? Some suggest that their brilliance was the culmination of millennia of earlier cultures like the Ubaid, while others believe the Sumerians carried knowledge from a forgotten homeland. The lack of clarity keeps their beginnings as mysterious as their end. Even their disappearance raises questions. While we know they were absorbed into later empires and their language faded from daily use, the process was gradual and poorly understood. At what point did they stop calling themselves Sumerians? How did ordinary people experience the transformation of their identity as they became Akkadians or Babylonians? These human experiences of loss and change remain hidden in silence, leading us to imagine what it felt like for the last generation to speak Sumerian as their mother tongue, knowing that their world was fading. These mysteries endure because they speak not only to gaps in our knowledge but to the fragility of human achievement itself. The Sumerians built cities, invented writing, and recorded their lives in clay, yet time has still swallowed much of their story. What we have are echoes, fragments of words, ruins of temples, relics of lives once vibrant. It is this incompleteness that captivates us, for the unanswered questions invite imagination and speculation, ensuring that Sumer remains alive not only in history but also in mystery. The legacy of Sumer is immense, for even though the people themselves faded, their ideas and inventions became the foundation upon which later civilizations were built. What began in the floodplains of Mesopotamia rippled outward across centuries, shaping cultures, empires, and entire ways of life. The Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and even modern societies carry echoes of Sumerian brilliance, often without realizing that the origins of so many human achievements can be traced back to this first great civilization. Their invention of writing was perhaps their most enduring gift. Cuneiform began as marks pressed into clay to count sheep, record grain, and track temple offerings. Over time, it evolved into a full system capable of expressing complex ideas, myths, laws, and prayers. Through writing, the Sumerians gave humanity a way to preserve memory beyond the frailty of speech. Every contract, hymn, and law written by later Mesopotamian cultures had its roots in Sumer. The act of writing transformed not only administration but also thought, allowing people to reflect, compare, and build upon what came before. Today, every written word, whether carved in stone or typed on a screen, carries within it the shadow of that first stylus pressed into clay. Their contributions to governance and law also influence the ages. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest surviving legal codes, laid out principles of justice and fairness that would later echo in Hammurabi's more famous code. These early laws revealed a society determined to establish order, regulate disputes, and protect the vulnerable. The idea that justice could be written down, preserved, and applied universally was revolutionary, forming the basis for legal systems across the world. In this sense, the Sumerians not only governed their own cities but also gave future generations a model for the rule of law. Science and mathematics also owe much to Sumer. Their base 60 numerical system remains with us today in the way we measure time, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, and in the 360 degrees of a circle. They observed the stars, charted the movements of planets, and created calendars that guided agriculture and ritual. Their medicine combined practical remedies with incantations, an early attempt to understand and treat illness. Each of these pursuits reveals a civilization seeking to bring order to the world, not only through religion but through observation and reasoning. Their blend of spirituality and science became the template for later cultures to expand upon. In architecture and urban planning, their legacy is equally profound. The very concept of the city as an organized space, with walls, markets, temples, and administrative centers, was pioneered in Sumer. The ziggurats they raised inspired later monumental structures, influencing temple designs across Mesopotamia and beyond. Their irrigation systems, carefully maintained canals, and methods of controlling water shaped the agricultural practices of civilizations for centuries. By transforming their harsh environment into fertile farmland, they proved that human ingenuity could overcome natural limits, an idea that continues to drive societies today. Culturally, their myths and religious systems became the foundation of Mesopotamian spirituality. Gods like Inanna, Enlil, and Enki were absorbed into later pantheons, their stories retold in new languages. The flood myth of Ziusudra became the model for later versions in Akkadian, Hebrew, and beyond, influencing the way humanity has told stories of divine judgment and survival. The Epic of Gilgamesh, born in Sumerian myths, became one of the world's first great works of literature, influencing epic traditions across cultures. These stories did not vanish with Sumer but traveled onward, shaping the imaginations of countless generations. Archaeological discoveries in the modern age have only deepened this legacy. Each tablet unearthed, each seal uncovered, reconnects us to the roots of civilization. Museums across the world display Sumerian artifacts, reminding us of how much of our daily lives, writing, timekeeping, laws, cities, originated from this ancient land. Scholars continue to study and translate their texts, keeping their voices alive and demonstrating the ongoing relevance of their ideas. In a sense, Sumer is not gone, it is present in every act of writing, every measurement of time, every story that asks about the nature of existence. The legacy of Sumer is therefore not confined to history but embedded in the fabric of human life. Though their language is no longer spoken and their cities lie in ruins, their influence surrounds us, often unnoticed but undeniable. They were the first to step into the experiment of civilization, and their footsteps continue to guide us. In this way, the Sumerians endure, not as a vanished people, but as the silent architects of the world we live in today. The struggles of Sumer carry lessons that reach far beyond their own time, for their decline was not simply the result of chance but the accumulation of choices, vulnerabilities, and patterns that echo in every civilization that has followed. At the heart of their story lies the reminder that greatness, no matter how dazzling, is fragile if balance is lost. They mastered the land with irrigation, yet their very success in harnessing the rivers brought long-term consequences. Over centuries, salts built up in the soil, turning once fertile fields barren. Farmers struggled to grow enough to feed their people, and the surpluses that had supported prosperity dwindled. This environmental mismanagement was not sudden but gradual, creeping forward unnoticed until it became impossible to reverse. The lesson is clear: human innovation must respect nature's limits, for when those limits are ignored, decline is inevitable. Inequality also eroded the foundations of Sumer. The prosperity of the Golden Age created stark divisions between the elites who thrived in luxury and the farmers, laborers, and debtors who bore the burden of sustaining them. Temples and palaces grew rich while ordinary people sank deeper into hardship. Families were forced into debt slavery, children sold to repay loans, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. Social fracture weakened their ability to stand together in times of crisis, making rebellion and unrest constant threats. The lesson here is that a society cannot endure if the wealth of the few is built upon the despair of the many. Without fairness, trust collapses, and with it the very bonds that hold communities together. Corruption and misrule further weaken them. Kings and priests who were supposed to embody divine justice often pursued personal power, hoarding wealth, or waging wars for glory rather than survival. Succession disputes brought instability, with rival claimants plunging cities into conflict. Each betrayal chipped away at faith in leadership and in the gods themselves, leaving people uncertain and divided. The lesson is stark: leadership demands integrity, for when those at the top lose sight of their duty to serve, even the most advanced civilizations begin to rot from within. Their constant rivalries also carried a fatal cost. Instead of uniting against external threats, the city-states of Sumer waged endless wars against one another, destroying the very resources they needed to survive. Canals were damaged, fields burned, and cities weakened by their own neighbors. This inability to cooperate, even in the face of looming disaster, ensured that when outsiders pressed in, Sumer was already too fractured to resist. The lesson here is that division within leaves a society vulnerable to threats from without. Without unity, even the strongest cities fall. Religion, once the pillar of their resilience, became a source of doubt as disasters multiplied. When floods destroyed fields or droughts brought famine, the people questioned whether their gods still favored them. The rituals and offerings that had once bound society together lost some of their power, leaving spiritual emptiness where once there had been certainty. The lesson is that faith, whether in gods, institutions, or shared ideals, must be nurtured and protected, for when it collapses, despair follows, and despair weakens the will to endure. These struggles reveal a larger truth: civilizations fall not from a single blow but from the slow erosion of their foundations. Sumer teaches us that the environment must be cared for, inequality must be addressed, leadership must serve the people, unity must be protected, and faith in shared values must be maintained. When these principles are forgotten, even the most brilliant society can crumble. Their story is both caution and mirror, reminding us that the struggles of the past are the struggles of the present, and that the lessons of Sumer are as urgent today as they were 5,000 years ago. The rediscovery of Sumer in the modern age has transformed what was once a forgotten name into one of the most celebrated foundations of human history. For centuries, the ruins of their cities lay buried under layers of sand and earth, their language lost, their stories silenced, their very existence unknown. Ancient writers remembered fragments of their legacy, but it was not until the 19th century, when archaeologists began to dig in Mesopotamia, that Sumer rose again into human memory. The broken tablets and crumbling walls they uncovered revealed a world far older and more advanced than anyone had imagined, and each discovery since has deepened our understanding of their importance. In the mid-1800s, explorers and scholars first unearthed cuneiform tablets in sites like Nineveh, Ur, and Uruk. At first, the strange wedge-shaped marks were undecipherable, but through painstaking work, scholars unlocked the script, opening a gateway to voices from 5,000 years ago. The words of Sumerian scribes, once silent, spoke again, recounting myths, laws, contracts, hymns, and laments. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged as one of the world's earliest masterpieces, reshaping how we understood the beginnings of literature. Legal codes revealed the roots of justice, while school texts showed the daily struggles of students practicing their lessons. Every tablet brought a new perspective, reminding us that the Sumerians were not abstractions but living people with worries, dreams, and ambitions much like our own. Excavations of their cities uncovered monumental architecture, from the ziggurats that rose like stairways to heaven to the intricate temples layered atop one another at Eridu. These ruins revealed not only engineering skill but also a society deeply devoted to its gods and organized around collective effort. In the royal cemetery of Ur, archaeologists uncovered graves filled with treasures, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and elaborately crafted lyres, alongside the remains of attendants who had been sacrificed to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. These discoveries painted a picture of a society where wealth, ritual, and belief intertwined in ways both awe-inspiring and unsettling. Advances in modern science continue to expand what we know. Soil analysis has confirmed that salinization contributed to their agricultural decline, offering evidence for what their tablets only hinted at. Remote sensing and satellite imaging have mapped ancient canal networks, showing the scale of their irrigation and the complexity of their urban planning. Digital tools allow scholars to reconstruct broken tablets, piecing together myths and histories once thought lost. Every new method sheds more light on their story, ensuring that Sumer remains at the forefront of archaeological inquiry. Beyond discoveries, the relevance of Sumer to our world today is profound. They were the first to wrestle with questions that still define us: how to organize societies, how to govern fairly, how to balance faith and reason, how to endure in the face of nature's power. Their struggles with environmental degradation remind us of our own fragile relationship with the earth. Their experiments in law and justice laid the groundwork for legal systems that still guide us. Their stories of gods, heroes, and mortality speak to universal human concerns, echoing in myths and traditions across the world. In many ways, Sumer lives on within us. The hours are clocks, the written words are pages, the concept of urban life, and the search for meaning in myth, all carry traces of their legacy. Each discovery reconnects us to the roots of our shared humanity, showing that the questions asked in the temples of Uruk or the schools of Nippur are the same questions we ask today. What is justice? What is our purpose? How do we survive, and how do we remember? The relevance of Sumer lies not only in what they achieved but in the way their story reminds us that civilization is a fragile, beautiful experiment, one we are still continuing. The rediscovery of Sumer has ensured that their voices are no longer silent. Archaeologists, linguists, and historians have brought them back into the human story, giving us both pride in our shared past and caution about our shared future. To look at Sumer is to look at ourselves, reflected in the clay of their tablets, the ruins of their cities, and the echoes of their myths. The lessons are clear, the relevance undeniable. We are heirs to their brilliance and also to their vulnerabilities. The story of Sumer closes not with certainty but with reflection, for even after thousands of years of study their civilization remains as much a mystery as it is a legacy. Scholars have uncovered temples, translated myths, and traced the rise and fall of their kings, yet the essence of who the Sumerians truly were continues to elude us. Their achievements were extraordinary: the invention of writing, the creation of law, the building of the first cities, but so too were their failures, the divisions, and the environmental missteps that led to their decline. In these dualities lies the power of their story, a mirror that reflects both the heights and the fragility of human endeavor. The mysteries that remain are reminders of how incomplete our knowledge is. The origins of the Sumerians are still uncertain, their language unlike any other, raising questions about where they came from and how they developed so quickly. Their myths, fragmented and broken, leave us wondering what fuller versions might have revealed about their worldview. Their sudden disappearance as a distinct people, absorbed into Akkadian and Babylonian cultures, raises questions about how identity dissolves over time. Were they aware that they were the last generation to speak their tongue, to write their prayers in cuneiform, to walk beneath cigarettes built for gods whose names would soon be forgotten? These unanswered questions keep their story alive, not as a closed book but as an unfolding puzzle. Modern scholars continue to dig, translate, and theorize, uncovering fragments of truth but never the whole picture. New technologies reveal canals invisible to the naked eye, tablets once unreadable are brought to light, and each year adds a new piece to the mosaic. Yet the fuller truth may never be known, for time has swallowed too much. The absence itself becomes part of their legacy, teaching us that even the most advanced civilizations leave behind only traces, and that those traces must be carefully pieced together by those who come after. Speculation about Sumer's true nature continues to fuel imagination. Some see them as pioneers who rose naturally from the conditions of Mesopotamia. Others wonder if their sudden leap into complexity suggests influences lost to history, forgotten cultures that seeded their brilliance. Their myths of gods descending from the heavens, of knowledge gifted by divine beings, invite interpretations that range from the spiritual to the speculative. Were these stories pure symbolism, or distorted memories of real encounters and events? The lack of final answers ensures that their civilization will always be a fertile ground for wonder and debate. Perhaps the most enduring thought is the warning their story gives us. They were the first to build cities, to organize law, to master rivers, yet their civilization faltered. Their decline was not a sudden catastrophe but the slow erosion of soil, justice, unity, and faith. It reminds us that progress is not permanent, that civilization is a delicate balance between innovation and restraint, between ambition and humility. In their fall lies a question that echoes for us today. If the first civilization, with all its ingenuity and divine mandate, could not endure, what of ours? And yet, their story is not one of despair but of inspiration. For even in their fall, they left behind the tools with which later civilizations would build anew. Their language shaped thought, their laws guided justice, their myths gave meaning, their cities inspired architecture. They remind us that while civilizations may crumble, their ideas endure, passed down, transformed, and reborn in new contexts. In this way, Sumer is not gone but alive within every society that measures time, records words, or seeks justice. The tale of Sumer ends not with silence but with a question, open and haunting: what will be remembered of us when we too become ruins? It is a question that refuses closure, ensuring that the first civilization continues to provoke wonder, caution, and reflection in all who hear their story. And so we come to the close of the journey into Sumer, the first great civilization, whose story began in the fertile floodplains of Mesopotamia and ended in silence, yet whose echoes remain with us still. They were the people who took mud and clay and shaped them into bricks, into wheels, into writing, into monuments that touched the sky. They were the ones who asked the earliest questions about life, death, and the gods, inscribing their doubts and hopes into clay tablets so that their voices would carry across time. Their greatness was matched only by their fragility, and in their fall lies the enduring reminder that all human achievements, no matter how magnificent, are bound by the cycles of history. As you reflect on their story, let it bring you not restlessness but peace. The Sumerians lived, thrived, struggled, and faded, and in their tale we see the eternal rhythm of creation and decline, a rhythm as natural as the beating of the heart and the rising of the sun. Their monuments are ruins now, their language silent, yet their spirit endures in every written word, every law, every city, every clock that marks the passage of time. Their story has not disappeared, it lingers as a gentle whisper across the ages, inviting us to listen, to wonder, and to dream. What do you think about the mysteries of Sumer? Do their myths, their struggles, and their legacy speak to you as they have to countless others who have studied their ruins? Share your reflections and theories in the comments, for each voice adds to the living memory of these ancient people. And if this journey has carried you this far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sleepy Dungeons so that you may return again and again to other forgotten corners of history, guided by stories meant not only to intrigue but also to soothe. Now close your eyes and let the calm of history cradle you. May your sleep be deep, your dreams gentle, and may the whispers of Sumer follow you only as a lullaby, reminding you that even in the silence of ruins, there is peace. Until next time, rest well and dream with light.